Well, thank you all for coming to be misinformed. And I'm really delighted to be up here with three great journalists and a politician who's thought very deeply about these questions. So yes, this is the panel on truth decay. You're looking for the dental tooth decay panel, next room. But the phrase truth decay comes from a Rand Corporation study, actually, which I was rereading last night, and which begins by talking about the history of it and by the yellow press in the United States in the 19th century, the rise of radio, which was this terrible scourge of misinformation in the 20th century. And I guess I wanted to start with you, Patrick. Are we in the middle of an epidemic of some new form of misinformation, or are we in a sort of moment of moral panic about something that's always been around?
Yeah, I think it's a really good place to start, because it's incredibly important not to be nostalgic about how the media and free press has worked in the past. And if you look at 19th century America, roughly mid-century, 80% of all newspapers, the dominant form of news, were controlled by political parties. So news was really a sort of form of political propaganda. You probably know this, but if you go a little bit further on in American history, you then had a very anarchic period of the kind of scurrilous media, often peddling misinformation. So this sort of problem has been around. I do think we are in a kind of very new and dramatic phase of it, and behind that is the rise of the tech platforms, which have disintermediated both political parties and the traditional media itself. And there are some unusual characteristics about it. I mean, one is that while 80% of the users of Facebook and Twitter are not Americans, the rules are being decided effectively by American companies and American norms. Obviously, there's a kind of anarchic sense of disinformation and misinformation globally, but there are other strands of it. There are insurgent political movements using the new mediums to gain power. Now, if it's Emmanuel Macron, people tend to applaud it. People like us. If it's the five-star movement in Italy or Donald Trump, people despair about it. And the last thing I think that is different and worth really thinking about is there is a huge push of state propaganda and censorship happening globally. Roughly 50% of the world lives somewhere where the internet is not free, and that number is rising sharply as governments use the pandemic as an excuse to push censorship. So all of those things are relatively new and different. If there is a lesson from history from liberal democracies, I think it is that one needs to be extraordinarily delicate and careful about policing speech.
So actually on that question, we have a poll that they've supplied on the most delicate and careful way to do it, to answer the crisis of trust, which I think they'll put up here behind me at some point, which you can answer in the apps, in the app, which is the options are tougher social media regulation, greater government transparency, stricter controls on money and politics, and actually it's overblown. And you can also, I would love to, if folks have questions, please send them in there as well, and I'd love to take audience questions, and you can put them in the app. Sarah, I think there are two. I think when you talk about misinformation, lies, however you want to call it, there are two big subjects, I think, right now that people are wrestling with COVID, in some countries more than others, and climate. And you're a Green Party senator in Australia, you've been really on the front lines of thinking about the media's role, particularly in dealing with climate. And I'm curious how you see it, how this conversation about misinformation, about social media, lines up with what you actually see on the ground in Australia.
Great question, and I think it's very easy to point the finger at social media for all of this, and I think Patrick's given a great summary of kind of let's not be too melancholy about how things used to be. Politicians have always exploited the situation, and I think what we're seeing happening in tandem right now is the explosion of social media, and through those platforms, much of which is unregulated, people being able to spread fake news and promote it as if it's somehow fact or the information the politicians don't want to show you. But on the flip side, there is such great distrust in politics. And there was a poll survey in Australia only last month that showed that the trust of our national government as an institution is down to 30%, which is horrifying. We're thinking about big crises like COVID, the pandemic, recovery, and now climate change. We want to be able to trust that our government is doing the right thing for the people, and when they speak, they're speaking the truth. And yet, in this whole situation, politicians have been able to go, okay, well, yes, there's a deficit of trust, or I think the decay word is actually even better because it kind of brings home, it's not just that we haven't invested in it, we haven't paid off the debt, we actually haven't been keeping an eye, monitoring, cleaning, really looking after what that important part of, particularly in a democracy, you have to have trust in government. So you have politicians who then say one thing one day and do another thing another, and it doesn't matter because, oh, well, everyone's telling lies on the internet, so who cares if the Prime Minister doesn't tell the truth? I think there's a really dangerous situation and nexus that we're heading into.
And is this sort of a new technical or media crisis of misinformation, or is this just politics?
Well, it is politics in the sense that politicians have always used spin, right? I guess the question is, when does spin become misinformation and deliberately misleading your community and your voters and the people you're meant to represent? In Australia, our Prime Minister came into question time holding a lump of coal. Has anyone seen that picture? And held it up in front of everybody on national television and said, "This is coal, do not be afraid," in the middle of a debate about climate policy. Now, that's a stunt, that's politics, but when it gets to a point of what the government's going to do on this horrible, dangerous threat of climate change, you've got the Prime Minister saying the one thing we need to deal with is not a problem. Well, I'd say that is disinformation. It's not just lying, it's a deliberate denial of the problem.
Okay. And David, to talk a bit about COVID, which you've spent a lot of time writing about, I'm curious how you see the phenomenon in the US, which I think is a much more straightforwardly social media phenomenon, at least to some degree. And I guess I'm curious, both what you see the causes of it among the people who aren't taking the vaccine, but also, is the other side, is sort of our educated, liberal, vaccine-taking population immune to these forces?
No, we're not immune to them. Now, they're not symmetrical, right? But it's one of these tricky things in which it's not 100% and zero, but it's also not 50-50. And I think we in the media often have a very difficult time with those stories, where it's not just one side says X, the other side says Y, who knows what's right, but it's also not black and white. And
but on the first part, what is wrong with Americans' brains on the ones who aren't taking it?
I mean, what's wrong with our brains is we're incredibly polarized from a partisan perspective. And so people tend to think, first, what team am I on, as opposed to what's right and what's wrong. And we've now seen this vaccine gap was not, at the beginning, it wasn't simply a partisan gap. It was more of an education gap than anything. And so you saw Democrats who hadn't graduated from college were also not getting the vaccine. That's largely gone away. It's now overwhelmingly a partisan gap, with Republicans not getting vaccinated, or more than half of them, and or a very large percentage of them, and Democrats almost universally so. Ben, the thing that you're talking about that we see kind of more on the left is we've seen an exaggeration and a misunderstanding of COVID risk in a whole bunch of places. So we've had colleges that have banned for periods of time outdoor exercise, right? Because they want to keep kids in their room at all times. That is counterproductive, right? I realize that Singapore has a mask mandate outdoors, but I don't think there's any scientific backing for an outdoor mask mandate. I've talked to people here close to the government, and what they've said is it's sort of a cost-benefit analysis. The cost of having one outdoors is so low that we think it's worth it. That's one take on it. But so what we've seen in the US is that I think a lot of people on the left have had a hard time thinking about the costs of interventions. And the way we saw this most last year was the closure of schools, which was even more heavily in what we call blue states. But we now see it in a bunch of different ways. And what's hard is, as soon as I'm saying this, I feel the need to say, I'm not equating the two. Refusing to take the vaccine is much, much worse than insisting everyone wear a mask at all times. But we still see a whole bunch of things on the left that are really not grounded in the science, even as people are putting up yard signs saying, in Dr. Fauci, we trust.
And do you think that, Trey, just since you used that word, how much of this in both of those cases is about trust?
I think it's about whom people trust. And so I think there are ways in which we end up in little circles, and I do think it's a lot about distrust. There was a very telling thing. There was a quite prominent anti-gun activist in the United States. And this spring, when cases were falling and the CDC announced that vaccinated people didn't have to wear a mask, this activist tweeted, "I'm going to keep wearing my mask just so no one thinks I'm a Republican." And so there's a way in which if people say, I so distrust the other side, I'm going to let that distrust define my behavior. I'm not going to think about what I actually need to do to stay safe. I'm going to look at the people I distrust, and whatever they're doing, I'm going to do the opposite.
Okay. And Lishan, you're the is the global editor and VP for Caixin, which is a great subscription business, by the way, which you should all subscribe to. But I'm curious, and we were talking earlier about this as to some degree kind of a business and business model question in the media, in social media, and I'm curious how you think about that.
So thank you, Ben, and for that free advertisement. And as I look into the best answers to the crisis of trust, I think it's important to add also an E, that media actually can do a better job. If we blame the social media for putting up the misinformation, disinformation out there, we trust the information we provide, and where is that? And are we leveraging the social media enough to get the information out? So one vivid example I remember is last year when the world was desperate about getting any information, practical treatment information about COVID. We organized several webinars. One is the frontline doctors, ICU doctors from China, and also infectious disease doctors from Singapore for a webinar. We are a financial and business media, and this is not our crowd. Just because of social media, we actually managed to get frontline medical workers from 40 countries to join that. And that was probably the most difficult panel I've ever moderated, because it's all about proning positions, incubation or whatever. There's very hardcore medical experiences, but I heard that some of the countries actually revised the medical rescue handbook after this. So that's unthinkable before the social media age. So if we can really use the social media, basically put our information out there, make our voice louder, I think that's something we can do instead of just blaming them. And another thing you mentioned, a business, it's very important for media as well to make sure we survive financially. And when the COVID hit, Warren is sitting there, the editor-in-chief of Straits Times. We joined several discussions among the publishers and the editors around the world and discussed what's the future of media, how hard are we hit in the COVID? Because many of them, David was asking, how often do you print? If you are relying on the printing revenue or advertisement, it's devastating. And we are lucky, and many of the media outlets are lucky, we set up the paywall. And paywall for us is not just a business model. Each time somebody hits the pay button, it's trust. You have more than 7 million people trust New York Times by hitting that button, and more than 1 million trust the Economist by hitting the button. And for Caixin, we are the first one first professional media set up a paywall in China. We have more than 700,000 people trusting us. So that gives us direct link with the readers. That also allows us to continue to do the job, to basically get the trustworthy information presented out there. So I think that's something as media, in addition to what we advocate for the changes in the government, in the society, it's something we can do ourselves.
Thank you. And so the poll results are back, and Sarah, I think this basically mirrors public opinion in general, which is there's a lot of interest in regulation, in government action on information, on speech, and on media in ways that make me incredibly nervous, honestly, as a journalist. And I know you've been really just in the weeds of that, both on the sort of investigation of the Murdoch media, particularly around climate, and on the Australian code for how the social media companies are dealing with the legacy or the traditional media. How do you walk that tightrope? How do you have some kind of government intervention in media that doesn't just wind up with the party in power putting its thumbs on the scale?
I think that's something that we always have to kind of be conscious of, and I get the concerns around too much regulation if it's impending on people's rights to access information. But ultimately, when it comes to, I think, these social media platforms, and they've just gotten much further ahead of government and community expectations, actually. If you could say the things you say on Facebook about somebody and promote those threats online, but if you did it in the shopping centre, or if you walked into somebody's house and said that, rather than going onto their Facebook page, you'd call the police. So I think community is now, and parents in particular, but the community is saying, hang on a minute, this is not right. We're using these platforms essentially as essential services. They're how we communicate, it's how we get information from government, it's how we communicate with our businesses, it's how we buy services. So there obviously needs to be some form of regulation, because there has to be a set of agreed rules by which we govern ourselves in society. So I think, yes, let's be careful about it, but the notion that social media should be forced to kind of have some form of regulation, I don't think is a problem. It's just the balance of that. The concern I have, and this kind of swings then back to the role of government in this, is if the community and the people don't feel that they have trust in the government and in government institutions, then how do you trust that the regulations they put in place will be the right ones? The question around mainstream media and what role mainstream media have in all of this, I think, is important too. So in Australia, we've been living under this environment where the Murdoch press control the majority of Australia's media. We have one of the least diverse media landscapes in the world, and as a result of that, a big part of the population don't trust what is printed in the daily newspapers. So if you don't trust what's online, you don't trust what your government's saying, and you can't trust what's being reported in the newspaper, it's a free-for-all. And I think that's what we have to, as policymakers, that's what we have to struggle with and wrestle with. It doesn't help when then there is a erosion of good quality journalism. And that comes from, that obviously comes from a revenue base. And mainstream media now kind of doing to compete with those advertising revenue sources such as online, having to do the clickbait. You don't have as much focus on good quality public interest journalism. And we need to find some ways to deal with that. Government needs to see and understand and help the community understand that investment in public interest journalism is ultimately good for them too. And I think from a political perspective, and just as an individual politician, I'd prefer people believed and had trust in the media that they consume, so that when they see something that is written about what I do and what I say, they can say, all right, oh, that must be happening, oh, that's good.
As long as it's a positive story.
Oh, I think even stories that criticise what politicians do, ultimately, it's about investment in your own in your own value to be believed by your constituents. So trying to control the media, or trying to just have positive stories, or control or shutting down the media if they don't write things that you don't like, and that's not good for politics. And I think that the community knows, and voters know, when their politicians are lying to them. The problem is whether it's just become normalised.
Patrick, there was this pretty extraordinary series of leaked documents out of Facebook earlier this year, published first in the Wall Street Journal, and that, I think in some ways deepened our understanding of a lot of what everyone knew was happening inside Facebook in terms of their, decisions to essentially not address a lot of problems that people internally were flagging around false information, around content that was potentially hurting teenagers. It felt to me like that story hit in a way that some of these stories haven't, and I'm curious if you think that the landscape around regulation is changing, either as a result of those stories or more broadly. Like, are you starting to see governments, move toward some kind of regulation of Facebook, whether you like it or not?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I absolutely agree. I don't know if any of you read the Wall Street Journal stories, but I mean, they really were absolutely riveting. And in particular, the accounts of people, the one that really struck me, I used to be our correspondent in India, and Facebook, I think, did an experiment where they created a kind of normal Indian user who simply accepted prompts that they were automatically given, and within 3 or 4 days, they were being fed extreme religious violence, which is just an incredibly irresponsible thing to happen, I think. So I do agree. I think there's been a step change. I do also think that within the sense of something must be done, there's a very big and broad menu of stuff, some of which I don't really agree with. I mean, some people would support the creation of kind of government or publicly owned equivalents, and being a Brit, I like the BBC, but I don't think it's really a model that can work globally. Some people would like kind of micro-regulation by the state of what appears on social media platforms, and although there is a role for things like defamation and obscenity, which even in the US are covered by the First Amendment, I don't think it should expand much beyond that. There's also this thing in the US of removing Section 230, which gives exemption from legal liability, which to my mind is a sort of punitive measure that doesn't really achieve clear goals. So, certainly our view, this is both my view and our take at The Economist, is really the best way for this to go is two separate things. One is actually self-regulation by the tech firms, where the adoption of more transparency about the algorithms, boards of accountability, systems of complaint, I think are very important. And in fact, that is how the media in the early 20th century dealt with the misinformation problem that existed then. It began to professionalize and have codes of conduct. The other thing I think is incredibly important is competition. So we have monopolies, and I think competition is important for two reasons. One is because if people have more choice, as you mentioned in Australia, there are more options. But also I think competition could ultimately create different business models that are less reliant on advertising, virality, sort of addictive behavior, and more reliant on subscriptions where people may take a more sophisticated view of what they're being given. And you may think that sounds a bit unrealistic, but one of the most interesting things that's happened recently is Apple's privacy settings have been changed, as you probably know, on ad tracking, and roughly 60% of Apple users who've been given the choice have chosen to opt out of that system. So I would argue in the long run, really, what we want is a more competitive industry that provides better products rather than very heavy-handed state intervention.
So nobody's going to stand up for very heavy-handed state intervention here. David, I mean, there is certainly on the right in the United States, all this whole conversation about misinformation, all the kind of blue ribbon panels that are putting together reports, the Aspen Institute has one out this week, are seen as a broad conspiracy to suppress conservative speech in general and to get Donald Trump in particular. Are they?
No. I think that when the political right in the United States has plenty of access to the megaphone of the media, right? It is certainly true that a certain type of publication, the news side of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that the people who work at those places are overwhelmingly on the left half of the political spectrum. And so that tends to get a lot of attention. But look at talk radio. Look at the cable TV that has the highest ratings. Even look in many communities at the owners of the local newspapers. These are not left-wing conspiracies. And so the political right in the United States still has a very, very good access to the benefits that the First Amendment provides. I think some of these reports are reflecting the fact that there is an objective problem. I mean, your question earlier, Ben, about COVID got at it. If you look at relatively basic questions of fact, like climate, like COVID vaccinations, we do have a problem on both the right and the left, but it is larger on the right. There is a greater percentage of Republican voters in the United States who believe things that are simply false. And I am defining that very narrowly. There is virtually nothing about abortion that is simply false. Right? I'm talking about demonstrable things like, do vaccines kill people or do they cure COVID? Is the earth getting warmer? Where was Barack Obama born? And so I think people trying to grapple with this sort of disease of falsehood on the political right are doing a good and important thing. That is not simply a conspiracy to prevent Donald Trump from being elected again.
It might have that salutary effect.
I mean, obviously Donald Trump's entire political history, right, begins with the combination of his fame from The Apprentice and his use of the birther lie, right? So this is not just another part of Donald Trump. It is the core of the Trump rise.
Right, and a certain kind of politics.
Ben, you said before, is anyone going to defend heavy-handed state regulation? I am not. But I simply would point out that if you think about just how much Facebook has come into our lives, Sarah, you mentioned this, things that are that big a part of our lives are always regulated. Railroads, healthcare, education, water. When you look at the role that Facebook plays in our lives, it's not like Bloomberg Businessweek magazine or the New York Times. It is much more important than a publication.
Could I just jump in there for a sec? I also think it's interesting that in this whole conversation about how mainstream media pay for their costs and advertising diminishing and having to go all online, they're crying out for government to regulate social media. But then when you talk about, okay, all right, well, how are you going? Are you actually up to your standard of quality journalism? What are you reporting on? Oh, no intervention, no intervention. So there is a bit of hypocrisy that goes on here, a bit of self-interest.
Well, we in the media industry are very grateful to Australia for beating the hell out of Facebook and causing them to give us all money. So thank you.
Yeah, well,
yes. But if you could stop there, that's fine.
The point is, exactly, the point is actually I think we all have to be a bit more responsible. Murdoch, at least in Australia, and I watched what happened with Fox News from afar, and Trump. So I find it extraordinary that you've got Republicans saying that they've got no access to, mainstream media. Like, what?
Do you think that sort of American free speech radicalism is sort of a problem in this conversation?
What do you mean?
That we're too wedded to this idea that the government can't intervene?
I think there is definitely a role for government in all of these conversations, because there's a role for the community in these conversations. But I come back to the point that if the government or politicians or leaders of the day are exploiting that decay of trust, then they've got no legs to stand on. And if we want to see better kind of respect of the community and society through these new platforms and existing platforms, mainstream, old-style media, then politicians have to lift their game as well.
Thanks. And we have some good audience questions if you have last chance to submit them. One's about, it's interesting, whenever there are these conversations about trust, one of the subjects that always comes up is local news, which I think everybody kind of intuits is deeply connected to this problem, even though it's not exactly clear how. And Li-Shen, I was curious, sort of how, the question is, local news has been decimated from a business model standpoint in particular, and I'm curious sort of how you see globally, really, that is playing a role or not playing a role in this sort of conversation, which is so often about big national and global issues.
Let me pick up a little bit on the Facebook, and I'll move on to the local news because they are intertwined. When we talk about the social media Facebook problem, we talk about that as an American problem, as an Australian problem, as a UK problem before Brexit. It's playing out big in this region as well, and sometimes people ignore it and how big and dangerous and potentially dangerous that could be. Speaking of local news, the China News Asia, based in Singapore, covered a story yesterday and says the Pakistan hackers meddled with the accounts from the Afghanistan government workers before Taliban took over. And among the Facebook leak, you read about how the extreme inflammatory comments flooded in India, which is the largest market of Facebook and is rising. So this part of Asia, many countries in Asia has a young demographic changes and have a huge penetration of smartphone. If you compare the numbers, Singapore is about 88% penetration. Cambodia, a country of 16 million population, 124% penetration. So that's the community are getting online, getting to use Facebook, getting to use the social media. We have the TikTok CEO, Joe, I don't know if he's in the audience, but he's on the NEF. If you ask him, he can tell you how obsessed the young generation are with short videos. So they are there. The problem will come, and the problem is there already, while the scrutiny is much less than what we discussed about the West. If you read about the Facebook leak, out of the Facebook budget to monitor or to do the content monitoring, only 13% allocated outside US. And think about the impact they have in this region. So it's I think it's a story that maybe the global coverage might not cover so well, but it's definitely up for the local media, for the local public bodies, including the government, the civil society, community, and media, to pick it up.
Thanks. And you know, all the rest of the question I've gotten are sort of, what's the solution? What's the silver bullet solution? Somebody here says that when they gave their family a newspaper, instead of reading Facebook every day, their view of the world totally changed. Is there anything you see that makes it, just, we got a couple more minutes, anything you see that makes you optimistic?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I think, I don't think we should desire a kind of quality media that's subsidized either by the state or by, tapping the profits of the tech firms. I think that's actually a disaster. So what you really want are healthy business models, which are the ultimate guarantor of quality journalism and editorial independence. And I do think there is grounds for hope. We have a couple of people here from the New York Times, which has shown there's a business model that actually works, which a lot of people are replicating. There's also money going into startups that do quality journalism. And alongside the thing I mentioned earlier of a drift of consumers towards a more privacy-conscious and hostile attitude towards targeted advertising, I think that is ultimately the source of optimism, that the industry drifts gradually away from this particularly weird and dysfunctional business model we've had over the last decade to something healthier, and I think that is now happening.
20 seconds each on something that makes you optimistic.
I think, generally speaking, Australia and people right around the world want leaders to be clearer, more collaborative, and more accountable. And they're using whatever means they've got to force them to do that. And I'm optimistic that starts to filter through. The business models work if people feel like what they're getting they can trust, and what they read they can honestly hand on to their friends, their community, and go, yeah, I believe this, and so should you. But ultimately, there has to be accountability. If there's not, then it's over.
Ben, you started here, but I think history is a source of some optimism. I mean, it's not like we've just had this wonderful media for all of human history. It's been deeply flawed. It's engaged in mistruths. It's often been a partisan media. I mean, the stories you read about JFK going back. And different models have worked in different points of history. It doesn't just have to be one model. A partisan press can actually work in a democracy. So can a nonpartisan press. I do think our current challenges are different because social media turbocharges everything. The number of people who read those lies about JFK was much smaller, and it happened much more slowly. So I'm not saying it's destined to work out, but I do think when we remind ourselves that these are not brand new problems, it is a healthy thing.
Got a last word, Shinley?
Well, I think when I talked with one of the editors at New York Times when Trump just got elected, and he says, we're lucky we have 4 years to figure out our business model. And obviously there is a Trump bump of the subscription of the New York Times, and when the COVID hits, we can see the hike of subscription for all the major mainstream newspapers and the media outlets. So that's something we have to cherish. I think continue doing the professional job, continue providing the high quality content, because that's the public goods we are serving, and that has increasingly a bigger value in the society, in the fast changing society. So have strong belief on that. And if we have to dance in front of TikTok, don't be afraid of that as well. So, I mean, this young generation has changed the model of information intaking. So we have to figure out a way. If dancing is not the right way, find us something that makes us familiar to them and accessible.
Just follow us on TikTok. Thank you so much for coming to this, and thanks for participating.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks.